Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. Go ahead and find your seats, get comfortable, because today we are treating this session as a full-on university masterclass. We're going to be diving into a brilliantly provocative research paper by Lucas Rafael de Andrade, and it's one that completely challenges the very foundation of how we view economics and development. The core thesis here is honestly pretty bold. Poverty does not exist. Okay, actually, scratch that. At least it doesn't exist in the way we usually think it does. The paper basically argues that poverty isn't a real positive entity with its own independent properties, it's just an absence. And treating it like a tangible thing, well, that's not just some philosophical quirk, it's a massive measurement error that literally skews real-world policy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our syllabus for today's lecture. 1. Poverty is not a thing. 2. The physics of absence. 3. How wealth actually works. 4. The proxy variable problem. 5. Counting blankets to measure cold. And finally, 6. Rethinking economics.
Section 1. Poverty is not a thing, a privative concept.
Let's kick things off with a Socratic question for the class. When economists measure poverty, or when governments target it, what exactly are we measuring? Are we measuring a distinct, independent variable that exists out there in the world, or are we, just measuring a shadow? To answer that, we have to unpack this pretty heavy academic definition right here, a privative concept. So, what does that actually mean? It means poverty is just a relational predicate. It's defined entirely by its position below a certain threshold, literally just a lack of income, wealth, or capability. It has absolutely zero positive content of its own. In the mathematical state space of the economy, there's no primitive variable called poverty. Poverty is merely the word we use to describe regions where positive resources are insufficient.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core concept perfectly, the difference between heat and cold. In thermodynamics, heat is a positive entity, right? It has flux, it has transport equations, quanta, and actual production mechanisms. Cold, on the other hand, not an entity. Cold doesn't flow. Cold is simply the state from which heat has departed. It has absolutely no properties of its own.
Now, if you apply that exact same thermodynamic logic to the economy, you get this massive aha moment. Wealth has flows, accumulation equations, returns, transfer mechanisms. Wealth is exactly like heat. Poverty, exactly like cold, is simply the state in which wealth is absent. It doesn't have any corresponding dynamics of its own. It can't grow, it can't be produced, it can't be carried. It is structurally identical to cold. So when we start treating poverty like an active entity, we are making a massive conceptual error.
Section 2. The physics of absence, substantializing nothing.
To understand just how common this kind of error is, let's take a really quick detour into the history of science. Back in the 18th century, scientists were trying to understand temperature, and they basically substantialized heat into something they called caloric, which they thought was this invisible fluid that flowed between bodies. I mean, they built perfectly consistent, highly sophisticated mathematical models all around this imaginary fluid. It wasn't until Rumford's friction experiments in 1798 and then Joule measuring the mechanical equivalent of heat in 1850 that science finally realized, wait, caloric doesn't actually exist. Heat was just energy in transfer. They had treated a state as a physical substance, which produced this completely ontologically confused framework.
And honestly, the history of science is absolutely full of these substantialized absences. Think about darkness for a second. Darkness doesn't propagate or diffract, it's simply the spatial region where photons are absent. Silence is just the absence of pressure perturbations above our auditory threshold. A vacuum, just the absence of matter. The author basically argues that treating poverty as a standalone variable is that exact same recurring scientific error. We're mistaking the lack of a resource for a tangible, causal entity.
Section 3. How wealth actually works. The positive dynamics.
So if poverty isn't the active variable, what is? Well, let's look at the actual mechanics of the economy. The paper highlights that wealth is the fundamental positive quantity here. Wealth dynamics are governed by flow, which is just income entering the economy. Then you have accumulation, where returns on existing wealth generate additional wealth. And finally, transfer, like taxes and redistribution. All the causal content, the actual mechanics, lies right here. Wealth accumulates, income flows, consumption draws it down. Poverty just sits there as a boundary line on a graph. It doesn't do anything.
So the crucial point is how we interpret things like poverty traps. We hear all the time that poverty reproduces itself across generations. But structurally, mathematically, that is impossible. Poverty traps are actually a failure of wealth reproduction. It's the geometry of wealth dynamics with multiple equilibria, specifically caused by things like borrowing constraints and low initial endowments. An agent in a low wealth basin simply cannot generate sufficient returns to escape. It is a dynamic of wealth, not a dynamic of poverty.
Section 4. The proxy variable problem. Methodological errors.
Now, sitting in on this masterclass, you might be thinking, okay, professor, this is a really fun philosophical debate, but why does it actually matter? Well, getting this definition wrong has completely devastating consequences for applied research. Here's the challenge researchers face out in the field. How do we actually measure poverty when direct data on a household's income or consumption is either way too costly to collect or just completely unavailable? Because, you can't exactly look at a family and magically know their bank balance.
Because researchers can't always measure true income, they tend to fall into what the paper calls the conditional cash transfer proxy trap. Basically, they use enrollment in government aid programs as a proxy for poverty itself. If a family is receiving a cash transfer, boom, the researcher codes them as poor. They are substituting a policy response variable, which is enrollment in a program, for the underlying welfare condition.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a critical flaw. The true welfare condition, falling below an income threshold, is often totally unobservable. But program enrollment, that is observable. The problem is that enrollment requires bureaucratic access, proper documentation, and local state capacity. A deeply deprived family in a remote rural area with poor state infrastructure might not be enrolled in the program at all, while a slightly better off family in the city might be. By using enrollment as a proxy, researchers introduce massive statistical bias, what econometricians call endogeneity and non-classical measurement error. Put simply, they are completely conflating the treatment with the actual disease.
Section 5. Counting blankets to measure cold. To truly hammer home just how absurd this proxy trap is, I want you to imagine trying to measure how cold it is outside by counting the number of blankets a household owns. It's ridiculous, right? Blankets are a response to the cold. They are absolutely not the cold itself.
And yet, this is exactly what econometricians are doing when they use program enrollment as a proxy for poverty. Let's break down this blanket fallacy. Yes, owning blankets correlates with living in a cold climate, for sure. But blanket ownership is also heavily driven by cultural practices, market access, and, whether you can actually afford blankets. Similarly, program enrollment correlates with poverty, but it's really driven by local administrative rules and political access. In both of these cases, the researcher is completely conflating the underlying condition with the institutional or behavioral response to that condition. It's a huge trap.
Section 6. Rethinking Economics. Scientific Precision.
If we actually stop treating poverty as a positive entity, it completely changes our entire framework. Even our most sophisticated poverty measurements, like the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke Index or Amartya Sen's capability approach, don't actually measure a poverty substance. Look at the components involved. They're essentially built from the empirical income distribution, population size, and a normative threshold we call Z. No matter how insanely complex the math gets, these indices are just summary statistics of the distribution of positive wealth and capabilities. They add absolutely zero new variables to the state space.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core takeaway from the text, and it's profound. One reduces poverty by increasing wealth and income, not by targeting an entity called poverty. Really think about that for a second. Every single successful poverty alleviation program, whether it's providing cash, food, health services, or education, works entirely on the positive side of the ledger. They don't extract some mysterious poverty substance from people. They just introduce positive resources into their budget constraints.
So I leave you with this final thought for today's masterclass. If poverty is genuinely just the absence of wealth, income, and capability, how does that fundamentally change the way you view social policy? This isn't just semantics, guys. It's a real call for scientific precision. When we stop substantializing absences, we can finally focus our models, our measurements, and our policies on the actual mechanics of wealth creation and distribution. Class dismissed. Let me know what you thought about this explainer and keep questioning the variables.